When Eleanor was forced to marry the wealthy cattle baron lying unconscious in his deathbed, she expected a life of lonely servitude, but she never expected to discover he could hear every word she whispered in the darkness. As conspirators plot his murder and she becomes his only hope for survival, Eleanor must choose between the freedom she's always wanted and saving the man who might be her true partner. Will Eleanor risk everything to save a husband she never chose? Or will she let the cattle baron's enemies succeed in their deadly scheme? The screaming wind ripped across the Montana hills like a wild animal searching for prey. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching dark clouds roll toward their small farm like an army ready to attack. The year was 1881, and winter was coming early to the territory. "Eleanor, get away from that window," her father's voice cut through the howling storm outside. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shaking as he held a piece of paper. His face looked gray, like someone had drained all the blood from his cheeks. "What's wrong, Papa?" Eleanor asked, her heart starting to beat faster. She had never seen her father look so scared, not even when the wolves came near their chickens last spring. He walked to his old wooden chair by the fireplace and sat down hard, like his legs couldn't hold him up anymore. The paper in his hands crinkled as his fingers trembled. "We owe money, Eleanor. More money than we have. More money than we can ever get." Eleanor felt her stomach drop like a stone thrown into a well. "How much money, Papa?" $3,000. The words came out like a whisper, but they hit Eleanor like a slap. $3,000 was more money than most people in the territory saw in their whole lives. "But Papa, we don't have that kind of money. Nobody around here has that kind of money." Eleanor sat down on the wooden floor beside his chair. "What happened? Why do we owe so much?" Her father's eyes filled with tears, something Eleanor had only seen once before, when her mother died 3 years ago. "I borrowed money to buy new cattle. The man said the price of beef was going up. He said we'd make enough to pay back double what I borrowed." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "But the cattle got sick. All of them died. And now the man wants his money back." Eleanor felt cold all over, colder than the winter wind outside. "What happens if we can't pay? We lose the farm. We lose everything." Her father looked at her with eyes full of pain. "But there's another way. The man who loaned me the money, he has a boss. A rich man who owns cattle ranches all over the territory." "What does that have to do with us?" Eleanor asked, though she was starting to get a bad feeling in her stomach. Her father reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. This one looked fancy, with gold edges and careful writing. "His name is Josiah Blackwood. He owns more land and cattle than anyone in Montana. He's been in an accident. Been sleeping for 2 months now, and the doctors don't know if he'll ever wake up." Eleanor stared at the fancy paper. "Papa, you're scaring me. What does this man have to do with our debt?" "His lawyers came to see me yesterday." Her father's voice got so quiet Eleanor had to lean closer to hear him. "They said Mr. Blackwood needs a wife, even though he can't wake up. They said if you marry him, our debt goes away. All of it." The words hit Eleanor like lightning. She jumped up from the floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Marry a man who's sleeping? Papa, that's crazy. I can't marry someone who might never wake up." "Eleanor, listen to me." Her father stood up and put his hands on her shoulders. "I know it sounds strange, but think about it. You'll have a big house to live in. You'll never be hungry or cold again. And if he never wakes up, you'll be a rich widow someday." "But I don't want to be a widow. I want to marry someone who loves me, someone who can talk to me and dance with me." Eleanor felt tears starting to fall down her cheeks. "This isn't fair, Papa. This isn't how marriage is supposed to work." Her father pulled her into a hug, but it didn't make her feel better. "Life isn't fair, sweetheart. But sometimes we have to make hard choices to survive." He held her tight. "The lawyers said if we don't agree by tomorrow, they'll take the farm anyway. At least this way you'll be safe." Eleanor pulled back and looked at her father's face. She could see how much this was hurting him too. He didn't want to send her away to marry a stranger any more than she wanted to go. But they were trapped like animals in a cage with no way out. What's he like, this Josiah Blackwood? She asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Rich, powerful. Some people say he's mean to people who cross him, but others say he's fair to people who work for him. Her father sat back down in his chair. Truth is, nobody really knows what he's like now. He's been sleeping for so long. The doctors aren't sure there's still a person inside that body. Eleanor walked back to the window and looked out at the storm. The wind was getting stronger, bending the trees until they looked like they might break. She felt like one of those trees, being pushed and pulled by forces too strong to fight. Where does he live? She asked without turning around. Big stone house about 20 miles north of here. Has dozens of people working for him, cowboys, housekeepers, cooks. They say his house is bigger than the church and the general store put together. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine living in a big stone house with a man who couldn't talk to her, couldn't laugh with her, couldn't even look at her. It sounded like the loneliest life in the world. But then she thought about her father losing the farm. She thought about him having nowhere to go, no way to make money. He was getting older, and his back hurt him more every day from years of hard work. If they lost the farm, what would happen to him? When would the wedding be? She asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. Next week. The lawyers want to get it done fast, before winter gets worse. Eleanor turned around to face her father. And you really think this is the only way? He nodded, fresh tears running down his cheeks. I've thought about it all night, Eleanor. I've tried to think of any other way. But there isn't one. We're out of time and out of choices. Eleanor felt something change inside her chest, like a door closing on her old life. She was 23 years old, and she had always dreamed of marrying someone who would love her the way her father had loved her mother. But dreams were for people who had choices, and she was learning that not everyone got to choose their own life. Okay, Papa, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'll do it. I'll marry Josiah Blackwood. Her father's face crumpled with relief and sadness all mixed together. Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this for you. I know, Papa, but maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe he'll wake up someday, and maybe he'll be kind. Eleanor tried to smile, even though her heart felt like it was breaking. And at least you'll be safe. That's what matters most. But as she spoke the words, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much more dangerous than a simple marriage to a sleeping man. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together properly. Why would a rich man's lawyers care so much about her father's small debt? And why did they need the marriage to happen so quickly? Eleanor had a lot of questions, but she was about to learn that in the world of rich and powerful men, questions could be very dangerous things to ask. The wedding dress felt like wearing someone else's skin. Eleanor stood in front of the long mirror in the biggest bedroom she had ever seen, staring at a stranger in white lace and silk. The dress had belonged to Josiah Blackwood's first wife, who had died 10 years ago. It fit Eleanor perfectly, which seemed impossible and somehow made everything feel even more strange. You look beautiful, dear. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, stood behind Eleanor, fixing the long white veil. She was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that seemed to see everything. Mr. Blackwood would be pleased if he could see you. Eleanor studied the woman's face in the mirror. Have you worked for Mr. Blackwood for a long time? 15 years. Mrs. Patterson's hands were gentle as she arranged the veil, but her voice sounded careful, like she was choosing each word before she said it. He's been a good employer. Fair wages. Decent treatment for all his workers. What was he like before the accident? Eleanor asked. She wanted to know something, anything about the man she was about to marry. Mrs. Patterson paused, her hands still on the veil. He was intense. Always working, always thinking about the ranch and the cattle. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. She met Eleanor's eyes in the mirror. Some folks were afraid of him, but I never saw him hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. Eleanor felt a chill run down her back. What do you mean, anyone who didn't deserve it? Before Mrs. Patterson could answer, a knock came at the door. Time for the ceremony, ma'am, called a man's voice from the hallway. Mrs. Patterson's face closed up like a book being shut. "Come along, dear. The preacher is waiting." Eleanor followed the housekeeper down a long hallway lined with paintings of serious-looking men and women. The house was even bigger than her father had described, with high ceilings and fancy furniture that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But despite all its beauty, the house felt cold and empty, like a place where laughter had forgotten how to live. They walked into a large room where a small group of people waited. Eleanor saw her father standing near the window, looking uncomfortable in his best suit. Beside him stood two men in expensive black coats who must be the lawyers. A thin man with a kind face held a prayer book, the traveling preacher who would perform the ceremony. And there, in the center of the room, was a bed. Eleanor stopped walking when she saw it. The bed was huge and made of dark wood, with curtains hanging around it like a small room within the room. And lying in that bed, perfectly still under white sheets, was the man she was about to marry. Josiah Blackwood looked like he was sleeping peacefully, but Eleanor could see that this wasn't normal sleep. His face was too pale, too still. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the sides, and his hands lay motionless on top of the white sheet. He looked like a king from a fairy tale, waiting for someone to wake him up with a kiss. "He's so still," Eleanor whispered. "The doctors say he can't feel anything," one of the lawyers said, stepping forward. "His body is alive, but his mind is gone. He's been like this for almost 3 months now." Eleanor walked closer to the bed, her wedding dress rustling with each step. Up close, Josiah Blackwood looked younger than she had expected, maybe 35 or 40 years old. His face was handsome in a strong, serious way, with lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time outdoors. But there was something else, something that made Eleanor lean closer to look at him more carefully. His eyelids seemed to flutter, just for a second, like he was dreaming. Eleanor blinked and looked again, but his face was perfectly still once more. "Did you see that?" she asked, turning to the others. "See what, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked. His eyes moved, just a little bit. The doctor, a nervous man with shaking hands, stepped forward quickly. "That's just muscle spasms, nothing more. The body sometimes moves even when the mind is gone. It doesn't mean anything." But Eleanor kept staring at Josiah's face. Something deep in her heart told her the doctor was wrong, though she couldn't explain why. "Shall we begin?" the preacher asked gently. Eleanor nodded, though her mind was spinning with questions. She took her place beside the bed, close enough to smell the clean scent of soap and something else, something that reminded her of leather and the outdoors. The preacher opened his book and began to speak the words that would make her Mrs. Josiah Blackwood. Eleanor tried to listen, but her attention kept drifting to the man lying so still beside her. The words floated around her like smoke. "Do you take this man, in sickness and in health, till death do you part?" When the preacher asked if she took Josiah as her husband, Eleanor's voice came out stronger than she expected. "I do." Then came the strangest part. The preacher asked if Josiah took Eleanor as his wife, and one of the lawyers answered for him. "He does, by legal proxy." It felt wrong, having someone else speak for the man she was marrying. But then the preacher told her to take Josiah's hand for the ring ceremony, and something amazing happened. Eleanor lifted Josiah's left hand from the sheet. It was warm and surprisingly strong, not lifeless like she had expected. As she held his hand, waiting for the lawyer to place the ring on his finger, she felt something that made her heart skip. His fingers moved, not a muscle spasm or an accident, but a deliberate, gentle squeeze around her hand. Eleanor's eyes flew to Josiah's face, but it remained perfectly still. She looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed, but they were all focused on the ring ceremony. The lawyer was sliding a gold band onto Josiah's finger, talking about legal rights and property transfer. Eleanor squeezed back, very gently, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so softly she almost missed it, Josiah's fingers pressed against hers again. Her heart started pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Josiah Blackwood was not as unconscious as everyone believed. He was aware, at least partially, of what was happening around him. But if he could respond to touch, Why hadn't he shown any signs to the doctors? Why was he pretending to be completely unconscious? As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor realized she had just married a man with secrets. And those secrets might be the key to understanding why his lawyers had been so eager to arrange the strange wedding. The ceremony ended with polite congratulations and talk of legal matters. Eleanor's father hugged her and whispered that he was proud of her. The lawyers shook hands with each other like they had just completed a successful business deal. Mrs. Patterson began organizing refreshments for the small group. But Eleanor barely heard any of it. She was thinking about the warm pressure of Josiah's hand and what it might mean. Was he trapped somehow, unable to speak or move normally? Was he in danger? And if so, what did that mean for her? As the others moved toward the dining room for cake and coffee, Eleanor lingered beside the bed. She pretended to adjust her wedding veil while she leaned closer to Josiah's ear. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispered, so quietly that no one else could possibly overhear. "But if you can, I want you to know that I felt your hand move. I know you're in there somewhere." She waited, watching his face carefully. For just a moment, she thought she saw his eyelids flutter again. But before she could be sure, Mrs. Patterson called from the doorway. "Mrs. Blackwood? Won't you join us for refreshments?" Mrs. Blackwood. That was her name now, Eleanor realized with a shock. She was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, the farmer's daughter. She was Mrs. Josiah Blackwood, wife to one of the richest men in the Montana Territory. But as she followed Mrs. Patterson toward the dining room, taking one last look at her new husband lying so still in the big bed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into the middle of a mystery much more complicated and dangerous than anyone had told her. Something was moving in the shadows outside Eleanor's window at 3 in the morning. She sat up in her new bed, heart racing as she watched dark shapes on horseback circle the main house like wolves hunting prey. Eleanor had been living in the Blackwood mansion for 5 days now, and every night brought strange sounds and mysterious visitors. During the day, everything seemed normal. Mrs. Patterson served meals. The ranch hands worked with the cattle, and Dr. Morrison came to check on Josiah. But when darkness fell, the house transformed into something that felt dangerous and full of secrets. She crept to the window and peeked through the heavy curtains. 3 men sat on their horses in the moonlight, talking in low voices. Even from the second floor, Eleanor could see they weren't dressed like regular ranch workers. These men wore guns on their hips and had the hard look of people who made their living through fear. One of the riders pointed toward Josiah's bedroom window on the first floor. Eleanor couldn't hear their words, but their body language made her stomach twist with worry. They were planning something, and it involved her sleeping husband. Eleanor grabbed her thick robe and quietly opened her bedroom door. The hallway was dark and silent, but she could see a thin line of light coming from under the door to Josiah's room. Someone was in there with him at this late hour. She tiptoed down the hall, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet. As she got closer to Josiah's door, she could hear voices, Mrs. Patterson's careful tone and a man's rough whisper. "How much longer do we have to keep this up?" the man was asking. "As long as it takes," Mrs. Patterson replied. "The boss said to keep him quiet until all the cattle are moved. After that, it won't matter what he remembers." Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they would hear it. They were talking about keeping Josiah quiet, which meant he wasn't naturally unconscious. Someone was making sure he stayed that way. "The new wife is getting suspicious," the man continued. "She asks too many questions about his condition." "Don't worry about her," Mrs. Patterson said with a cold laugh. "She's just a farm girl who got lucky. She doesn't know anything about running a ranch or managing business. Keep her busy with household duties, and she'll stay out of our way." Eleanor felt anger burn in her chest. They thought she was stupid just because she came from a small farm. They had no idea that growing up poor had taught her to notice things, to listen carefully, and to survive by being smarter than people expected. The voices stopped suddenly, and Eleanor heard footsteps moving toward the door. She quickly but quietly ran back down the hall and slipped into her room, closing the door just as Josiah's door opened. She waited by her window until she saw the rough-looking man leave the house and ride away with the other mysterious visitors. Only then did she allow herself to think about what she had heard. Someone was keeping Josiah unconscious on purpose. They were moving his cattle somewhere, probably stealing them. And they thought his new wife was too dumb to figure out what was happening. Eleanor smiled grimly in the darkness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, Eleanor came downstairs for breakfast acting like she hadn't heard anything unusual. Mrs. Patterson served her eggs and bacon with the same polite manner as always. But Eleanor noticed the housekeeper's eyes were more watchful than before. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor said sweetly, "I'd like to start learning more about running the household. Since I'm the lady of the house now, I should understand how everything works." Mrs. Patterson's smile looked forced. "Of course, dear. What would you like to know?" "Well, I notice Dr. Morrison comes to see my husband quite often. What exactly is he doing to help Josiah recover?" "Just checking his condition, making sure he's comfortable," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "The doctor is very thorough." Eleanor nodded and took a bite of her eggs. "I'd like to be present during his next visit. I want to understand my husband's medical needs better." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "I don't think that's necessary, dear. Medical matters can be quite upsetting for ladies to witness." "I'm stronger than I look," Eleanor said with a bright smile. "My mother was sick for a long time before she died, so I'm used to caring for people who can't care for themselves." Before Mrs. Patterson could argue further, young Tom burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement and worry. "Mrs. Patterson, ma'am, you need to come quick. Some of the cattle in the north pasture are missing again." Henrik found broken fence posts and hoof prints leading toward the river. Eleanor watched Mrs. Patterson's reaction carefully. The housekeeper's face went through several emotions: surprise, anger, and something that looked like fear. "How many head are missing?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Henrik thinks maybe 50 or 60. That's the third time this month." Tom glanced at Eleanor nervously. "Should I tell the sheriff?" "No," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, then caught herself. "I mean, not yet. Let's wait and see if they just wandered off. Sometimes cattle break through fences when they smell water." Eleanor knew that was nonsense. Cattle didn't break through fences in organized groups and disappear without a trace. Someone was stealing them, and Mrs. Patterson didn't want the law involved. "Tom," Eleanor said, standing up from the breakfast table, "would you show me where this happened? I'd like to see the broken fence myself." Tom looked confused. "Ma'am, I don't think that's something a lady needs to worry about. My husband owns these cattle," Eleanor said firmly. "That makes them my concern too. Until he wakes up, someone needs to pay attention to what's happening on this ranch." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward quickly. "Mrs. Blackwood, I really don't think that's appropriate. Ranch work is dirty and dangerous. Your husband wouldn't want you riding around the countryside looking at broken fences." Eleanor met the housekeeper's eyes with a steady gaze. "Since my husband can't tell me what he wants, I'll have to make my own decisions. Tom, please have someone saddle a horse for me." Tom looked back and forth between Eleanor and Mrs. Patterson, clearly torn between conflicting orders. Finally, he nodded to Eleanor. "Yes, ma'am. I'll get Daisy ready for you. She's real gentle." As Tom hurried out to prepare her horse, Eleanor could feel Mrs. Patterson's angry stare burning into her back. The housekeeper had expected to control the new wife easily, but Eleanor was proving to be more difficult than planned. An hour later, Eleanor rode across the rolling hills of the Blackwood Ranch with Tom leading the way. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and the wide Montana sky stretched endlessly above them. For the first time since her marriage, Eleanor felt like she could breathe freely. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" she asked Tom as they rode. 3 years, ma'am. Started when I was 15. Mr. Blackwood gave me a job when my pa died and my ma couldn't feed all us kids." Tom's voice held real gratitude. "He's a good boss, fair and honest. Always paid us what he promised." "What was he like before the accident?" Tom was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He was Intense, I guess. Real smart about cattle and business. But he treated his workers right, and he never cheated anybody. He glanced at Eleanor. Some folks said he was too hard, but I think he just didn't like people trying to take advantage of him. They reached the broken fence, and Eleanor could see immediately that this wasn't the work of wandering cattle. The fence posts had been cut cleanly, probably with wire cutters. The ground showed clear signs of many horses and cattle being driven through the gap in an organized way. "Tom, this wasn't an accident," Eleanor said, pointing to the cut wires. "Someone deliberately opened this fence to steal cattle." Tom's face went white as he looked more closely at the evidence. "You're right, ma'am. I should have seen that before." He looked around nervously. "What should we do?" Eleanor studied the hoof prints leading away from the broken fence. They headed north toward the river, just as Tom had said. But something about the pattern bothered her. The tracks were too organized, too purposeful. This wasn't the work of casual thieves, it was a planned operation. "Tom, how often do cattle go missing from this ranch?" "More often lately," Tom admitted. "Started about 3 months ago, right around the time Mr. Blackwood had his accident." He paused, then added quietly, "Some of the other hands have been talking. They think something strange is going on." Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle starting to come together in her mind. Josiah's accident had happened 3 months ago. The cattle thefts had started around the same time. Someone was keeping her husband unconscious, and that same someone was stealing his cattle while he couldn't stop them. "Tom, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to tell me the truth." Eleanor turned her horse to face him directly. "Do you trust Mrs. Patterson?" Tom's face showed his internal struggle. "She's been here longer than me, ma'am. She knows how to run the house and manage things." "That's not what I asked. Do you trust her?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the empty pasture where 50 head of cattle should have been grazing. "No, ma'am," he finally said. "I don't. And neither did Mr. Blackwood." Toward the end, he was asking questions about missing supplies and strange visitors. He was starting to watch her real careful like. Eleanor felt her heart race with excitement and fear. "Tom, what if I told you I think my husband might not be as unconscious as everyone believes?" Tom's eyes went wide. "Ma'am, what do you mean?" "I mean, I think someone is keeping him sedated on purpose. And I think that same someone is stealing his cattle while he can't stop them." Eleanor leaned forward in her saddle. "The question is, are you willing to help me figure out who's behind it?" Tom stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood saved my family when we had nowhere else to turn. If someone's hurting him, I want to help stop them." Eleanor smiled, feeling like she finally had an ally in this strange and dangerous situation. "Good. But we have to be very careful. If these people are willing to keep a man unconscious for 3 months, they won't hesitate to hurt us if they find out what we're doing." As they rode back toward the house, Eleanor's mind was already working on a plan. She needed to find out exactly what Dr. Morrison was giving Josiah during his visits. She needed to learn more about these mysterious nighttime visitors. And most importantly, she needed to find a way to communicate with her husband without anyone else knowing. The farm girl that Mrs. Patterson thought was too stupid to cause trouble was about to become the biggest threat to their criminal operation. Eleanor had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she was finally ready to use that to her advantage. The medicine bottle felt cold and heavy in Eleanor's hand as she held it up to the lamplight in Dr. Morrison's medical bag. She had waited 3 days for the perfect opportunity. A moment when the doctor stepped outside to smoke his pipe and Mrs. Patterson was busy in the kitchen to search through his supplies. The label on the bottle made her blood run cold. Laudanum, for severe pain, administer sparingly. But the bottle was nearly empty, and Eleanor knew Dr. Morrison had filled it fresh just last week. Someone was giving Josiah far more of the powerful sleeping drug than any doctor would recommend. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Dr. Morrison's voice came from the hallway, closer than Eleanor had expected. She quickly put the bottle back and stepped away from his bag, her heart pounding. When the doctor entered Josiah's room, Eleanor was standing innocently beside her husband's bed, holding his hand like a devoted wife. "How is he today, doctor?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Dr. Morrison's nervous eyes darted between Eleanor and his medical bag. "The same, I'm afraid. No change in his condition." He moved quickly to check that his supplies were undisturbed, then relaxed slightly when everything appeared to be in place. Eleanor watched him carefully as he prepared Josiah's afternoon medicine. The doctor's hands shook as he measured the laudanum, and he kept glancing toward the door like he expected someone to interrupt him. "Dr. Morrison," Eleanor said suddenly, "I've been reading about head injuries in some medical books. Don't you think 3 months is an unusually long time for someone to remain unconscious?" The doctor nearly dropped the medicine bottle. "Medical books? Mrs. Blackwood, I hardly think that's appropriate reading for a lady. These matters are too complex for someone without proper training." Eleanor bristled at his dismissive tone, but she kept her voice sweet and innocent. "Oh, I know you're much smarter than me, doctor. I just worry about my husband so much. I want to understand everything about his condition." Dr. Morrison prepared the syringe with shaking hands. "Your concern is touching, but unnecessary. Your husband's brain was severely damaged in his fall. It's actually quite common for patients in his condition to remain unconscious for extended periods." Eleanor knew he was lying. She had spent hours in Josiah's study reading his medical books, and everything she had learned told her that 3 months of complete unconsciousness usually meant the patient would never wake up. Yet Josiah's body was strong and healthy, his breathing normal, his skin color good. He looked like a man who was simply sleeping deeply, not someone with severe brain damage. As Dr. Morrison approached Josiah with the syringe, Eleanor made a decision that could change everything. "Wait," she said, stepping between the doctor and her husband. "I'd like to try talking to him first. I've read that sometimes familiar voices can help unconscious patients." "Mrs. Blackwood, that's really not necessary. Please, doctor, just give me 5 minutes alone with him. Maybe if I tell him about our marriage, about how much I care for him, it might help." Eleanor forced tears into her eyes, playing the part of the desperate, loving wife. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable, but he couldn't refuse such a reasonable request without seeming heartless. "Very well, 5 minutes, but don't get your hopes up. He can't hear you." Eleanor waited until the doctor left the room, then quickly moved to Josiah's bedside. She leaned close to his ear, pretending to whisper sweet words while actually watching the door carefully. "Josiah," she breathed, so quietly that only someone right beside her could hear. "If you can hear me, I know someone is drugging you. I found the laudanum bottle. They're giving you enough to keep a horse unconscious. Move your hand if you understand me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so slowly that she almost missed it, Josiah's fingers curled slightly against the sheet. Eleanor's heart leaped with excitement and terror. He was definitely conscious, at least partially. But that meant he was trapped in his own body, aware of everything happening around him but unable to speak or move normally. "Listen carefully," she whispered urgently. "Dr. Morrison is coming back with more medicine. I'm going to try to spill it or distract him, but if I can't, try not to let it affect you too much. Fight against it. I'm going to get you out of this, but I need your help." Josiah's fingers pressed against hers briefly, a signal that he understood. Dr. Morrison returned to the room, carrying his syringe and looking impatient. "Time's up, Mrs. Blackwood. I need to administer his medication now." Eleanor moved away from the bed reluctantly, her mind racing for a way to stop the doctor without making him suspicious. As Dr. Morrison approached Josiah's arm with the needle, Eleanor pretended to stumble and caught herself against his arm. "Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor," she gasped as the syringe fell to the floor, its contents spilling across the wooden boards. Dr. Morrison's face turned red with anger. "Mrs. Blackwood, look what you've done. That medication is expensive and difficult to obtain." "I'm so sorry. I felt dizzy for a moment. Let me help you clean it up." Eleanor knelt down and began wiping up the spilled laudanum with her handkerchief, making sure to soak up every drop. Dr. Morrison stood over her, his fists clenched with frustration. This is exactly why wives shouldn't be present during medical procedures. Your emotional state is interfering with your husband's care. Eleanor looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Will you have to get more medicine? I feel terrible about this accident. Yes. I'll have to return tomorrow with a fresh supply. Dr. Morrison packed his remaining supplies with jerky, angry movements. Please ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. After the doctor left, Eleanor sat beside Josiah's bed, her hands trembling with the excitement of what she had discovered. Her husband was awake inside his motionless body, and she had just bought him one full day of freedom from the drugs that were keeping him prisoner. But she knew Dr. Morrison would return tomorrow with more laudanum, and she couldn't accidentally spill medicine every day without arousing serious suspicion. She needed a better plan, and she needed help from someone she could trust completely. That evening, Eleanor found Tom in the barn, tending to the horses. She looked around carefully to make sure they were alone, then pulled him into an empty stall where no one could overhear them. Tom, I need to tell you something incredible, but you have to promise me you won't tell anyone else. Tom's young face was serious as he nodded. I promise, ma'am. My husband is awake. He's been conscious all along, but someone is drugging him to keep him helpless. Eleanor watched Tom's eyes widen with shock and anger. Dr. Morrison has been giving him laudanum every day, enough to keep him unconscious but not enough to kill him. But why would they do that? Tom asked, his voice filled with confusion and rage. Because someone is stealing his cattle, and they need him out of the way while they finish the job. Eleanor gripped Tom's arm urgently. I spilled today's medicine by accident, so Josiah will be more alert tonight than he's been in months. But tomorrow, Dr. Morrison will be back with more drugs. Tom's hands curled into fists. What can we do? How do we stop them? Eleanor had been thinking about this all afternoon. First, I need you to find out everything you can about the missing cattle. How many are gone, where the tracks lead, who might be helping the thieves from inside the ranch. But be careful. Don't let anyone know what you're doing. What about Dr. Morrison? We can't let him keep poisoning Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor's face set with determination. I'm going to find a way to replace his laudanum with something harmless. If Josiah can stay conscious for a few days, maybe he'll be strong enough to help us fight back. Tom nodded eagerly. Henrik might help us. He's been working this ranch longer than anyone, and he knows Mr. Blackwood isn't the kind of man who would just let cattle wander off without investigation. Be very careful who you trust, Tom. We don't know how many people are involved in this conspiracy. Eleanor looked around the barn nervously. Someone has been planning this for months, maybe even years. They've been patient and careful, which makes them very dangerous. As if summoned by her words, they heard footsteps approaching the barn. Eleanor quickly moved away from Tom and pretended to be petting one of the horses. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the barn doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene suspiciously. Mrs. Blackwood? What are you doing out here so late? I wanted to check on the horses, Eleanor said innocently. Tom was telling me about their care and feeding. I think it's important for me to understand all aspects of ranch life. Mrs. Patterson's smile was cold and calculating. How thoughtful. But perhaps you should return to the house now. The evening air can be quite chilly, and we wouldn't want you to catch cold. Eleanor recognized the polite words for what they were, an order disguised as concern. Of course. Thank you for your consideration, Mrs. Patterson. As Eleanor walked back to the house, she could feel the housekeeper's eyes boring into her back. Mrs. Patterson suspected something, which made their situation even more dangerous. But Eleanor had spent her whole life being careful and clever, and she wasn't about to give up now. She had a husband to save, cattle thieves to catch, and a mystery to solve. The scared farm girl who had arrived at the Blackwood Ranch a week ago was gone, replaced by a woman who had discovered she was much stronger and smarter than anyone had ever expected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. But tonight, for the first time in months, Josiah Blackwood would sleep naturally instead of being drugged into unconsciousness. And Eleanor would be watching over him, ready to protect the man she was beginning to care about more than she had ever imagined possible. Josiah's eyes opened in the darkness at exactly midnight, clear and alert for the first time in 3 months. Eleanor, who had been sitting in the chair beside his bed reading by lamplight, nearly dropped her book when she saw him looking directly at her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough from months of silence but unmistakably strong. "We don't have much time before they check on me again." Eleanor's heart hammered with excitement and fear as she moved closer to his bed. "You're really awake. I was right. They've been drugging you." Josiah struggled to sit up, his muscles weak from months of forced inactivity. "Morrison's been giving me enough laudanum to drop a bull, but my body has been building resistance. I've been conscious for short periods every day, listening, learning who I can trust." His dark eyes fixed on her face with intensity. "You saved my life today by spilling that medicine." "Josiah, there's so much I need to tell you. The cattle thefts, the nighttime visitors, Mrs. Patterson working with them " "I know about the cattle," Josiah interrupted, his voice filled with controlled rage. "Over 1,000 head stolen in the past 3 months. They're being driven across the territory border into Wyoming, where Craddock has buyers waiting who don't ask questions about ownership papers." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Craddock? You know who's behind this?" "Frank Craddock, my former foreman. I fired him 6 months ago when I caught him selling information about our cattle movements to competitors. But I never imagined he'd come back to steal everything I'd worked to build." Josiah's hands clenched into fists despite his weakness. "He's been planning this revenge for months. But Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Morrison, how did he get them to help him?" Josiah's expression darkened. "Money and fear. Craddock promised Mrs. Patterson a share of the profits from selling my cattle. Morrison has gambling debts that Craddock threatened to expose to the medical board." He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been admiration. "But they never counted on my new wife being smart enough to see through their lies." Eleanor felt a flush of pride at his words, but there was no time for pleasant feelings. "What do we do? Dr. Morrison will be back tomorrow with more drugs. Even if we refuse his treatment, Craddock might decide to just kill you outright." "That's exactly what he plans to do," Josiah said grimly. "I heard him and Mrs. Patterson talking 2 nights ago. Once they move the last of the cattle, they're going to make my death look like a natural decline from my injuries." Eleanor felt ice-cold fear wash through her. "When?" "Soon. Maybe within the next few days." Josiah reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "Eleanor, you need to leave this place. Tonight. Ride to town and bring back the territorial marshal. Tell him everything you've discovered." "I'm not leaving you here defenseless." Eleanor's voice came out more forcefully than she intended. "If Craddock realizes you're awake, he might kill you before I can get back with help." Josiah stared at her, clearly not used to being argued with, especially by a woman he barely knew. "Eleanor, you don't understand how dangerous these men are. Craddock has killed people before. I won't have your death on my conscience. And I won't have yours on mine," Eleanor shot back. "We're married, remember? That means we face this together." Before Josiah could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Eleanor quickly extinguished the lamp and helped Josiah lie back down, arranging his body to look unconscious. She moved to her chair and picked up her book, pretending to read in the darkness. Mrs. Patterson opened the door and peered inside, her sharp eyes scanning the room suspiciously. "Mrs. Blackwood? It's very late. Perhaps you should retire to your own room." "I like reading to my husband," Eleanor said calmly. "Even if he can't hear me, it makes me feel closer to him." Mrs. Patterson's gaze lingered on Josiah's still form, then moved to Eleanor. "Of course, dear, but do try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor waited several minutes before lighting the lamp again. When she turned back to Josiah, his eyes were open and filled with a new respect. "You're braver than I expected," he admitted quietly. "I'm more stubborn than brave," Eleanor corrected. "My father always said I was too stubborn for my own good. But maybe that's exactly what this situation needs." Josiah actually smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Eleanor had seen on his face. "Then we'd better make a plan. Because tomorrow, when Morrison can't drug me properly, everything is going to change." They spent the next hour developing their strategy. Eleanor would continue to act like the naive farm girl everyone expected her to be, while secretly gathering evidence and allies. Josiah would pretend to be still unconscious, but he would be listening and preparing to act when the moment was right. "Tom is loyal to you," Eleanor told him, "and Henrik suspects something is wrong with the cattle thefts. But we need to be careful about who else we trust." "What about the other ranch hands?" Josiah asked. Eleanor had been thinking about this. "Some of them act nervous around Mrs. Patterson, like they're afraid of her. I think Craddock might be threatening their families to keep them quiet." Josiah's jaw tightened with anger. That sounds like him. He always preferred fear to loyalty as a management tool. As dawn approached, they finalized their plan. Eleanor would continue her daily routines while secretly observing everyone's behavior. She would also try to find written evidence of the cattle sales papers that could be used to prove the theft in court. "Where would Craddock keep records of the stolen cattle?" Eleanor asked. "He's too smart to keep them here at the ranch. But Mrs. Patterson might have copies, or at least information about when the next cattle drive is planned." Josiah's eyes were growing heavy as exhaustion from his first night of natural consciousness caught up with him. "Her room is on the 3rd floor, in the servants' quarters." Eleanor felt her stomach drop at the thought of searching Mrs. Patterson's private space. "That's incredibly dangerous. If she catches me, if we don't find evidence soon, we'll all be dead anyway," Josiah pointed out grimly. "Craddock won't let any witnesses live once he's finished stealing everything I own." As the sun began to rise outside the windows, Eleanor helped Josiah return to his pretense of unconsciousness. She arranged his body carefully, making sure he looked exactly as he had for the past 3 months. "Eleanor," he said softly, just before closing his eyes, "whatever happens today, I want you to know that marrying you was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. Even under these circumstances." Eleanor felt her heart flutter at his words. "Save your pretty speeches for after we survive this," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "I plan to collect on a lot of compliments once this is over." Josiah's quiet laughter followed her as she left his room to prepare for what might be the most dangerous day of her life. Eleanor's hands shook as she held the damning letter in Mrs. Patterson's empty bedroom, but not from fear, from pure, burning rage at what she was reading. The letter, written in Craddock's crude handwriting, laid out the entire criminal plan in horrifying detail. She had snuck into the housekeeper's room while Mrs. Patterson was busy in the kitchen preparing lunch. The letter had been hidden under a loose floorboard beneath Mrs. Patterson's bed, along with a stack of money that represented Eleanor's husband's stolen cattle. 200 head moved yesterday, the letter read. Final drive planned for Friday night. After that, eliminate B and make it look natural. The widow won't cause problems. She's too simple to understand business matters. Friday night. That was tomorrow. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice as she realized how little time they had left. But the letter contained something else that made her stomach twist with horror. At the bottom, in different handwriting, was a list of names, ranch hands and their families, with notations like wife and 3 children, and elderly mother lives with family. Craddock wasn't just threatening the workers. He was threatening to hurt their loved ones if they interfered with his plans. Eleanor quickly memorized the contents of the letter, then carefully returned it to its hiding place. She had to get this information to Josiah immediately, but first she needed to make sure no one suspected what she had discovered. She crept down the servants' stairs and slipped back into the main house through the kitchen entrance. Mrs. Patterson was nowhere to be seen, but Eleanor could hear voices coming from the dining room, unfamiliar male voices that made her pulse quicken with alarm. Eleanor tiptoed to the dining room doorway and peered around the corner. 3 rough-looking men sat at her dining table, eating her food and drinking from Josiah's expensive whiskey bottles. She recognized one of them as the man who had been talking with Mrs. Patterson in Josiah's room a few nights ago. "Everything's ready for tomorrow night," the largest man was saying. "The buyers across the border have the money waiting." Once we deliver this last herd, we'll be rich enough to disappear forever. What about the boss? Asked another man, jerking his thumb toward Josiah's room. Craddock wants him dead before we leave. Morrison's bringing something special in his medicine bag today. The first man replied with an ugly grin. Something that'll stop his heart nice and peaceful like. Make it look like his injuries finally caught up with him. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping out loud. They weren't just planning to steal the cattle. They were planning to murder Josiah this very afternoon. She backed away from the doorway as quietly as possible, her mind racing. Dr. Morrison would arrive for his daily visit in less than 2 hours. Instead of laudanum to keep Josiah unconscious, he would be bringing poison to kill him permanently. Eleanor had to warn Josiah and get him away from the house before Morrison arrived. But how could she move a man who had been bedridden for 3 months without arousing suspicion? The answer came to her as she passed the kitchen window and saw Tom working with the horses in the corral. Tom was loyal, trustworthy, and strong enough to help move Josiah if necessary. But she needed to reach him without the men in the dining room seeing her. Eleanor slipped out the back door and circled around the house, staying close to the buildings to avoid being spotted. When she reached the corral, she grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him behind the barn where they couldn't be overheard. Tom listened carefully. My husband is going to be murdered today unless we stop it. Eleanor spoke in rapid, urgent whispers. Dr. Morrison is bringing poison instead of medicine. We have to get Josiah away from the house before the doctor arrives. Tom's young face went white with shock and anger. What can we do, ma'am? Mr. Blackwood can barely move after being unconscious for so long. He's stronger than they think, Eleanor said, making a quick decision to trust Tom with the full truth. He's been awake for short periods every day. The drugs were keeping him weak, but yesterday I accidentally spilled his medicine, so he's more alert than he's been in months. Tom's eyes widened with understanding and hope. So he knows what's been happening to his cattle? He knows everything, but right now we need to focus on keeping him alive. Eleanor glanced nervously toward the house. Can you hitch up a wagon without anyone noticing? We need to get him away from here. Where can we take him? These men probably have people watching all the roads to town. Eleanor had been thinking about this during her frantic run to the barn. Henrik's cabin. It's hidden in the woods about 2 miles from here, and Henrik has been suspicious about the cattle thefts. He might help us. Tom nodded eagerly. Henrik's a good man. He's worked for Mr. Blackwood for 10 years and never liked Mrs. Patterson's attitude. He glanced toward the house where smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. But how do we get Mr. Blackwood out of the house without those men seeing? Eleanor's mind worked frantically through possible plans. The laundry wagon. Mrs. Patterson sends dirty sheets and towels to the washerwoman in town every week. If we load the wagon with laundry baskets, we could hide Josiah under the linens. That might work, Tom said slowly. But what about you? If you disappear at the same time as Mr. Blackwood, they'll know you helped him escape. Eleanor felt a chill as she realized Tom was right. Someone had to stay behind to make Josiah's disappearance look natural, to deflect suspicion and buy time for them to reach safety and get help. I'll stay, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll tell them Josiah seemed restless, so I decided to take a walk in the garden. When Dr. Morrison can't find him, I'll act confused and worried, like a helpless wife who doesn't understand what happened. Tom looked skeptical. Ma'am, that's real dangerous. If they figure out you helped him escape, they won't hurt me as long as they think I'm just a stupid farm girl, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. Besides, someone needs to gather evidence about the cattle thefts. That letter I found proves their guilt, but we need to get it to the territorial marshal. Before Tom could argue further, they heard Mrs. Patterson's voice calling from the house. Mrs. Blackwood? Where are you, dear? Eleanor's heart jumped. I have to go before she gets suspicious. Get the wagon ready and wait for my signal. When you see me hanging a white sheet on the clothesline, that means it's time to move Josiah. She hurried back to the house, trying to look innocent and carefree despite the terror churning in her stomach. Mrs. Patterson met her at the kitchen door, her sharp eyes scanning Eleanor's face for signs of trouble. "There you are. I was beginning to worry. Dr. Morrison will be here soon for your husband's afternoon treatment." "I was just getting some fresh air," Eleanor said with a bright smile. "The house feels so stuffy sometimes. I thought I might do some reading in the garden after the doctor's visit." Mrs. Patterson's expression relaxed slightly. "What a lovely idea. The autumn flowers are particularly beautiful this time of year." As Eleanor headed upstairs to Josiah's room, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In the next hour, she would either save her husband's life or watch him die. And if their plan failed, she might not survive the day either. But Eleanor had discovered something important about herself during her weeks at the Blackwood Ranch. She was much stronger and braver than anyone had ever expected. The scared farm girl who had agreed to marry a stranger was gone, replaced by a woman willing to risk everything to protect the man she was learning to love. Time was running out, but Eleanor Blackwood was ready to fight for her future and her husband's life. The gunshot that shattered the afternoon quiet came from Henrik's cabin just as Eleanor was hanging the white sheet on the clothesline. Their agreed signal for Tom to rescue Josiah. Eleanor's hands froze on the clothespin as the echo rolled across the hills, followed by shouting voices and the thunder of horses galloping toward the woods. What was that? Mrs. Patterson appeared at the kitchen door, her face pale with alarm. Eleanor forced herself to look confused rather than terrified. It sounded like hunting, maybe, though it seemed awfully close to the house. But Eleanor's heart was pounding with the horrible knowledge that their escape plan had been discovered. Someone must have seen Tom loading Josiah into the laundry wagon. Or perhaps Henrik's cabin hadn't been as safe a hiding place as they'd hoped. Mrs. Patterson disappeared back into the house, and Eleanor could hear her talking urgently with the men in the dining room. Their voices were too low to understand, but their tone was angry and worried. Eleanor had to know what had happened. She dropped the remaining sheets and ran toward the woods, her skirts catching on bushes as she pushed through the undergrowth. The sound of horses grew louder, and soon she could see riders approaching through the trees. Tom was in the lead, riding hard with blood streaming down his face from a cut on his forehead. Behind him, supported in the saddle by Henrik's strong arms, was Josiah, awake, alert, and very much alive. "Eleanor," Josiah called when he saw her. "Get back to the house. Craddock is here with a dozen men." But Eleanor was already running toward them, her mind focused on one thing. Her husband was safe and conscious and fighting back. "What happened?" "We heard a gunshot. Craddock was waiting at Henrik's cabin," Tom gasped as he slid down from his horse. "He knew we'd try to hide Mr. Blackwood there. But Henrik was ready for trouble. He's been suspicious for weeks." Henrik helped Josiah down from the horse, supporting him as his legs shook from months of forced inactivity. "Craddock tried to shoot your husband in cold blood," the old ranch hand said grimly. "But I put a bullet in his shoulder instead. He'll live, but he won't be using that arm for shooting anytime soon." Eleanor felt a fierce surge of pride and gratitude toward the weathered old man who had risked his life to save her husband. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of more horses approaching fast. "They're coming after us," Josiah said, his voice strong despite his physical weakness. "We need to get to town and bring back the territorial marshal, but we can't outrun them with me barely able to sit a horse." Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from help. But they had one advantage that Craddock didn't know about. Eleanor had found the letter that proved his guilt. "The letter," she said suddenly. "I found Craddock's letter in Mrs. Patterson's room. It has all the details about the stolen cattle and the plan to kill you. If we can get that evidence to the authorities." "Where is it now?" Josiah asked urgently. "Hidden under Mrs. Patterson's floorboard. But she'll destroy it the moment she realizes we've escaped." Henrik checked his rifle and frowned at the approaching sound of pursuit. "We can't fight a dozen men in open country. But if we can get back to the ranch house, we might be able to hold them off long enough for someone to ride to town for help." "That's too dangerous," Josiah protested. "We'd be trapped in the house with them surrounding us." Eleanor looked at her husband's determined face, then at Tom's loyal young features and Henrik's grizzled courage. These men were willing to die fighting for what was right, but Eleanor had a different idea. "What if we don't fight them at all?" she said slowly. "What if we make them think they've already won?" All three men stared at her in confusion. "Explain," Josiah said. Eleanor's plan was risky and required perfect timing, but it might be their only chance. "Tom, how good are you at acting?" Tom looked puzzled. "Acting, ma'am? I need you to ride back to the house alone, looking defeated and scared. Tell Mrs. Patterson and Craddock's men that Henrik and Josiah are both dead, shot during the fight at the cabin. Tell them I ran into the woods and you couldn't find me." Understanding began to dawn on Tom's face. "You want them to think they've won." "Exactly. If they believe we're all dead or scattered, they'll drop their guard. Mrs. Patterson will probably want to search Henrik's cabin to make sure the bodies are really there. While she's gone, I can sneak back into the house and get that letter." Henrik shook his head dubiously. "That's an awful big risk, Mrs. Blackwood. If they catch you in the house, they won't be looking for me if they think I'm lost in the woods," Eleanor pointed out. "And once I have the letter, we'll have proof of their crimes even if we can't stop the cattle theft." Josiah gripped her hand tightly. "Eleanor, I won't let you go back into that house alone. It's too dangerous." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw not just concern, but something deeper, real caring, maybe even love. The marriage that had started as a business arrangement was becoming something precious and real. "Josiah, you can barely stand up after months of being drugged. Tom and Henrik need to stay with you to keep you safe. I'm the only one who can move through the house without being seen." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, I'm getting tired of everyone thinking I'm just a helpless farm girl. It's time to show them what this farm girl can really do." Before anyone could argue further, the sound of approaching horses grew much louder. They could see dust rising through the trees as Craddock's men spread out to surround their position. "We're out of time," Henrik said, raising his rifle. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Eleanor made the decision for all of them. "Tom, ride back and tell them we're dead. Henrik, take Josiah deeper into the woods and keep him hidden until I come back with the letter. I'll meet you at the old abandoned mill by the river in 2 hours." Eleanor Josiah started to protest. She silenced him with a quick, fierce kiss, their first real kiss as husband and wife. "Trust me," she whispered against his lips. "I didn't save your life just to lose you now." Tom mounted his horse and rode toward the house, his shoulders slumped in fake defeat. Henrik helped Josiah deeper into the forest, moving carefully to avoid leaving tracks. Eleanor waited until both groups were out of sight, then began her own dangerous journey back to the house. She circled wide through the woods, approaching from the side where the kitchen garden would provide cover. As she crept through the vegetables and herbs she had planted during her lonely weeks as Josiah's unconscious wife, Eleanor realized how much she had changed. The scared young woman who had agreed to marry a stranger was gone, replaced by someone brave enough to risk everything for love and justice. But she also realized something else that filled her with both hope and terror. She was no longer fighting just to save Josiah's life or recover his stolen cattle. She was fighting for their future together, for the chance to build a real marriage based on partnership and genuine affection. The house loomed ahead of her, looking peaceful in the afternoon sun despite the evil plans being hatched inside its walls. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and prepared to enter what might be the most dangerous place in the entire Montana territory. But she was no longer afraid. She was Eleanor Blackwood, and she was going to save her husband, catch the criminals, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely people could be the strongest when it mattered most. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept through Mrs. Patterson's bedroom, her ears straining for any sound that might signal discovery. Through the window, she could see Craddock's men gathered in the yard below, their voices carrying clearly in the afternoon air as they discussed their next move. "Burned the cabin to hide the bodies," one man was saying. "No evidence left of what happened there." Eleanor's blood ran cold. If they had really burned Henrik's cabin, then Tom's performance had been perfect. Craddock's gang truly believed their enemies were dead. She found the loose floorboard exactly where she remembered it, and her fingers closed around the damning letter that would prove their crimes. But as she started to stand up, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up to the 3rd floor. Eleanor quickly replaced the floorboard and looked desperately around the small room for a hiding place. The only option was under Mrs. Patterson's narrow bed, a space barely big enough for a person but her only chance of avoiding detection. She squeezed under the bed just as the door opened. Through the gap between the bed frame and the floor, Eleanor could see Mrs. Patterson's black shoes and the hem of her dark dress. "Stupid girl," Mrs. Patterson muttered to herself as she moved around the room. "Should have known better than to trust a farm girl with any real intelligence." Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making any sound. Mrs. Patterson was searching for something, probably the letter Eleanor now had hidden in her dress pocket. The housekeeper's feet stopped right beside the bed, and Eleanor heard the sound of the floorboard being lifted. Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath told Eleanor that she had discovered the missing letter. "Craddock!" Mrs. Patterson's voice turned shrill with panic. "Craddock, get up here now." Heavy boots thundered up the stairs, and Eleanor saw Craddock's worn leather boots enter the room. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, evidence of Henrik's accurate shooting. "What's wrong?" Craddock's voice was rough with pain and anger. "The letter's gone. Someone took it from my hiding place." Craddock's boots shifted as he spun around the small room. "That's impossible. You said the girl was dead, and the old man and the boss burned up in the cabin." "I thought they were," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice rising with fear. "But someone's been in this room. Someone who knew exactly where to look." Eleanor's heart sank as she realized their deception had been discovered. But she still had the letter, and if she could get out of the house with it, they would have the evidence needed to convict the criminals. "Search the house," Craddock ordered. "Search every room, every closet, every hiding place. If someone's alive and has that letter, we're all headed for prison or the gallows." Mrs. Patterson's shoes disappeared from Eleanor's view as she hurried from the room. Craddock's boots remained still for a moment. Then he too left to join the search. Eleanor waited until their footsteps faded down the stairs, then carefully crawled out from under the bed. Her dress was covered with dust, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but she still had the letter and she was still alive. The problem now was getting out of the house without being caught. She could hear Craddock's men searching the lower floors, their boots heavy on the wooden floors as they opened doors and overturned furniture. Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at the yard below. 2 men stood guard near the kitchen door, while others searched the barn and outbuildings. But the window faced the back of the house, where the vegetable garden provided some cover. The window was small and high off the ground, but it was her only escape route. Eleanor gathered her skirts and climbed onto Mrs. Patterson's washstand, then carefully opened the window. The drop to the ground looked much farther from up here than it had seemed from below. Eleanor took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and swung her legs over the windowsill. She hung by her hands from the window frame for a moment, then let go. The impact when she hit the ground knocked the breath from her lungs and sent sharp pain through her left ankle, but she was alive and free. Eleanor limped through the vegetable garden, using the tall corn stalks for cover as she made her way toward the woods. Behind her, she could hear shouting from inside the house as the search continued. The abandoned mill where she had arranged to meet Josiah, Henrik, and Tom was a mile away through dense forest. With her injured ankle, the journey would be difficult, but Eleanor was determined to reach safety with the evidence that would bring these criminals to justice. As she entered the woods, Eleanor heard a commotion from the house behind her. Craddock's voice rose above the others, filled with rage and desperation. "Find her. She's got the letter, and if she reaches town with it, we're all dead men." Eleanor pushed deeper into the forest, ignoring the pain in her ankle and the branches that caught at her dress and hair. The letter in her pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but it was also the most precious thing she had ever carried. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind her, horses crashing through the underbrush, men shouting directions to each other. Craddock was throwing everything he had into catching her before she could escape with the evidence of his crimes. Eleanor's ankle gave out completely as she reached a small stream, and she fell hard on the rocky bank. For a moment, she lay still, fighting back tears of pain and exhaustion. She could hear the horses getting closer, and she knew she couldn't outrun them with her injury. But then she heard a different sound, a single horse approaching from the direction of the mill. Eleanor looked up to see Tom riding toward her, leading a second horse. "Mrs. Blackwood," Tom called softly as he reached her. "Mr. Blackwood sent me to find you. He was worried when you didn't come to the mill." Eleanor had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. Tom helped her onto the spare horse, and together they rode toward the mill where Josiah and Henrik waited. When they reached the old building, Eleanor practically fell from her horse into Josiah's arms. Despite his own weakness, he held her tight against his chest, and she could feel his heart pounding with relief. "I have it," she whispered against his shoulder. "I have the letter that proves everything." Josiah pulled back to look at her face, his eyes bright with pride and something deeper. "Eleanor, you're the bravest person I've ever known, but you're also the most stubborn." Eleanor managed to laugh despite her exhaustion and pain. "You married a stubborn farm girl, remember? You're stuck with me now." Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "We need to get to town fast. Craddock's men will figure out where we've gone soon enough, and they'll come after us with everything they've got." Josiah looked at Eleanor's swollen ankle and his own shaking hands. "Can we make it to town before they catch us?" Eleanor pulled the letter from her pocket and held it up. "We have to. This letter proves they stole over 1,000 head of cattle and planned to murder you. It's enough evidence to put them all in prison for the rest of their lives." Tom grinned fiercely. "Then let's ride. I know a back trail that leads straight to the territorial marshal's office. If we push hard, we can be there before dark." As they prepared for the final race to safety, Eleanor realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the reluctant bride who had married a stranger out of duty. She was a woman who had chosen love over safety, courage over comfort, and partnership over protection. The cattle baron's bride had become something much more powerful. A woman who had saved her husband's life, exposed a criminal conspiracy, and discovered that the strongest bonds aren't forged by law or duty, but by the choice to stand together when everything is on the line.